Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge. Our season preview series rolls on here today. I am joining you as always from my home in Raleigh. Mark is joining us from frigid Mobile, Alabama. He's
gearing up for
wearing
snow.
long sleeves.
Oh yeah, I only have like three long sleeve cold weather outfits, and boy, I'm having to use them over and over again because we're supposed to have snow. It's just, I'm not used to this.
Yeah, not one but two D1 staffers expected to get snow next
Mhm.
weekend, and none of those people are Shotgun, who lives in Philadelphia, Bradley, who lives in Philadelphia, Patrick,
Yeah,
who lives in Wisconsin, although he very likely may be getting
yeah.
snow for all I know. I guess
Days
I
that
haven't
end in
looked.
Y, right?
Right, exactly. But yeah, Kendall in Houston and Mark in Mobile expected to get snow this coming week, and this next week, and that's it's pretty incredible.
Hmm.
I grew up in Houston, and I can only remember one or two what I would call legitimate snows. So the fact that they've got one is pretty incredible. So anyhow, we will today we're going to preview a team that is not necessarily a stranger to snow. Knoxville, Tennessee, a place that can get some of the powder from time to time. Maybe you've heard of them, Mark. The Tennessee Volunteers, coming
Yeah.
off a pretty good season, coming off a national title winning season. So we're gonna jump into them today. If you're just jumping onto the series, quick intro to it. Mark and I do a preview podcast for all 16 SEC clubs. So far, we're doing backwards alphabetically. So far, we've done Vanderbilt, Texas A&M, Texas. Now we're doing Tennessee. So go back and listen to those if you're interested, and stick with us as we lead up to opening day, previewing all 16 SEC clubs. Mark, we have Tennessee number 4 in the preseason. They were a hard team. Well, on two fronts, they were a hard team to peg because
Yeah.
one, they're kind of in a cluster with LSU and Arkansas, in this part of the rankings, and then secondarily, if this team didn't have Tennessee across its chest, I'm not sure we'd have it ranked 4th, just because there are questions to answer here, and yet I think just there we have enough respect for the way that coaching staff has developed and recruited talent over the years that at this point it just feels like whether it's on opening day or whether it's in May, they're going to end up being, an upper crust type of team when it's all said and done.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's definitely a laundry choice for picking the balls because I do think you look at the talent that they lost. I mean, what's that? 6 position starters, probably 6 of their top 7 pitchers, something like that. Um, they've got to replace, and that's some really talented kids that are no longer in orange. However, when you recruit and you develop the way that this staff has done over the last, I don't know, 5, 6 years now, um, it's just sort of they've earned the benefit of the doubt, and because it's not just that they're bringing in talent, but they've been able to take guys that maybe don't do a whole lot for a year or two and develop them, and they make a tremendous jump and quote come out of nowhere to be a real star in the conference, and that's what we expect this year. And I do think though that it's a different kind of pressure after you've won the title, right? And we've talked about this before because a lot of the fun is in the chase, and then once you get there, it's uh, what do you do now? What's next? Is that still, and hopefully, for their sake, is that still that hunger to go out and do it again? And everybody's going to say there is, but are you taking that next step? Are you doing all the things that you need to do in order to make sure it happens again? Because, in this league, and when you're talking about who Tennessee compares themselves against, it's the top of the college baseball world, and that's a really unforgiving place. So if you have a setback, if you have some injuries, you have some slumps, you don't have that guy develop like they have in the past, then the margin for error is so small that you could not reach those lofty goals. And that'll be one of the, I guess, the bigger storylines as we follow Tennessee spring.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to look at here. One is as we mentioned, just having a lot of respect and giving the benefit of the doubt to this program for being able to put them back in position to be in Omaha again.
Mm-hmm.
But on the flip side, I do think it is interesting that we got a glimpse with LSU last year of a team that by the very end, if they're in a super regional that's not UNC,
Mm-hmm.
with a couple of other exceptions, obviously, like they're very likely in Omaha and probably would have given everybody a run for their money there because that's how well they were playing. But for the first 3 months, it was
Yeah.
not pretty for them all the time. Right. And so I think that last year, because it's one thing for Mississippi State and Ole Miss where for different reasons, there was kind of a little bit of a fall off there. With LSU, I don't think there was that same level of fall off. It was just a matter of the pieces coming together and becoming a team. And so it is a reminder that in this league, versus some others, obviously, that I don't mean that as a disparagement, but just there are other leagues where you might be able to just keep your head above water long enough to
Mm-hmm.
figure it out, and your record still looks like nothing ever went wrong, right?
Yeah.
But in this league, you end up with seasons like LSU's where it was probably in terms of talent a top 10 team, top 8 team. They just took too long to get there, to put them in a position to play at home and
Yeah.
get them back to Omaha. And so there is also that on the table for Tennessee. I'm not saying they're going to go 13-17 in the SEC, anything like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up, at least for part of the season, being a little more similar to 2023, where a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of a slow start. They figured it out late. They were super dangerous late, obviously. They ended up
Right.
getting back to Omaha. I wouldn't be surprised if they end up being the number 4 team in the country, but for large
Mm-hmm.
swaths of the season, maybe they don't, because it just takes them a little
Mm-hmm.
while to get going. So I think it is important to realize that there are a lot of ways in which this ranking could turn out being accurate. Rare is the team that we peg to finish 4th or 8th or 12th or 16th that ends up just being that same place the entire season, right?
Yeah.
There are ups and
Yeah.
downs, and it's all about where we think they'll end up. And there's a lot of ways to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that when you have this many new faces and even the returning faces are in different roles, like a guy like Dean Curley, who was, he didn't have to carry a huge burden for the offense last year. Well, he's one of the guys this year, right? Hunter Inslee, another one, really good player, but more of the, he's an extra piece instead of having to carry the mantle. And I mean, those are going to be two of the two of the top players in that Vols lineup. So how do they step up? And we think they will. But again, that's part of what this whole process is about. Every year, the stars move on, and there's a new batch of stars, and that's who we think, for Tennessee are going to be two of those primary ones. I think the other thing to think about with the Vols uh, is how they are able to kind of carry the burden of getting everybody's best shot, because Tennessee has had that for since their great breakthrough seasons, and every team kind of handles it a little bit different. You mentioned the 23 team that really was so different from the 22 team and didn't always juggle those expectations as well. Well, this team, not only do they have the expectations of just being Tennessee, but they won the whole thing last year, and here we are picking them top 5 again. So it's how to without a ton of returning leaders. They have some, but without a bunch of those, what does that look like? So that for me is, those are the kinds of things I'm looking for. And then we hadn't even talked about on the field, and that's probably where you want to go next. But this is a talented club. They brought in some transfers that have a chance to make an impact. There's some freshmen who who certainly are going to get a chance to be everyday players, and and I think that because of the overall talent, certainly our staff, we're bullish on where they're going to end up. But when you have that many pieces that need to be meshed, it can take a few minutes. And I think that's what's going to be fascinating with them early versus, as you mentioned before, what they look like in May and June.
Where I have the most confidence is the lineup for a couple of reasons. One is they do have some foundational pieces back there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dean Curley, Hunter Inslee, who's kind of the glue guy
Mm-hmm.
of the entire operation. I think that's big. And even guys like Cannon Peebles and Dalton Bargo, who weren't necessarily linchpins of last year's team, but they were there and they played meaningful minutes, to use a basketball term, meaningful minutes all the way through to the national championship, right? So I think that's valuable. And then even in some of the guys you bring in, I mean, Gavin Keelan from Louisville, okay, that program has been a little down the last couple of years, but it's still a
Mm-hmm.
ACC program that plays at a high level. And then Andrew Fisher is familiar with the SEC. Say what you will about the 3 teams in 3 years thing. I mean, they have 2 of them. They also have Liam Doyle, who's in that same bucket. But this is a program that can kind of get who they want in the portal, which is not to say they'll get everybody they ever want, but they're going to be in the mix for anybody. And if they weren't if they're not worried about that, I'm not worried about that. The whole like, oh, he's been on his 3rd team, it's a mercenary type of mindset. Like, they wouldn't take him if they didn't feel like he was a guy for them, because they could find a talented player anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, they're not. I mean, they are very selective in who they bring in, because they're not one of these these clubs that bring in double-digit transfers every year. They're gonna find 3 to 5 who they feel like can actually make an impact, and not and that's often because they've recruited so well. They have so many guys. You don't want to block the development for some of these really high ceiling players.
They're not into the idea of buying lottery tickets in the transfer portal.
Mm-hmm.
Some programs have to, right? Because you just don't have access to that kind of talent in traditional methods. But Tennessee's not one of those. Like, they're not buying lottery tickets in the transfer portal.
Yeah, and you have to in your philosophy of roster construction, you have to make a decision. Do I want the older guy who maybe has a higher floor, but maybe his ceiling isn't as high, versus the younger guy who's got a wide range, right? Low floor, high ceiling, and you need those high ceiling guys to win it all. But how many of those do you need, and how many can you have, right? Because they're not all going to hit. So you need those high floor guys to certainly blend in and have a mixture. And Tennessee, to their credit, has done a really good job of straddling that line.
One of the things you alluded to it earlier, but one of the very best things that this program has done under Tony Vitello and his staff is they do just have guys who just pop. Trey Lipscomb didn't do much for 3 years. 4th year, boom, he becomes a superstar, and now like he's in the big leagues. Kavaris Tears last year was that guy. I think on the mound you could even make the argument that Aaron Combs was that guy. But on the position player side specifically, it feels like the guy that is easiest to point to is Reese Chapman, because in a small sample he was pretty good. Again, albeit in a small sample, and like, he's toolsy. It's somebody that we've known about his entire career. It's not like he's a guy who just totally came up out of nowhere, which, by the way, is similar to Lipscomb and Tears in that they were not just totally anonymous guys who popped. They were guys that we had heard about as like, hey, these guys are toolsy. These guys have ability. It might take some time, but it's eventually going to click. That's kind of the same stuff we've heard about Reese Chapman. So it's not just that they have a guy like poof out of thin air. It's that they're talented guys that eventually develop to the point of being able to do something special.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly has the ability, and he's going to get the opportunity. I mean, the outfield, with Hunter Inslee, with Chapman, and freshman Jay Abernathy, who's likely going to be, an opening day leadoff man. Just had a tremendous fall. But that's, this is not as deep as some of the Tennessee lineups that we've had and some of the Tennessee position rosters. They have some, they have some guys, and there'll be some develop as we've discussed, but at least heading into it, it's like 12 to 13. It's not, 18 guys that you're trying to find spots for. And sometimes that's the right amount. So if you get everybody enough work, I think that's going to be key. I think, what does first base look like? Alex Perry was a guy that had a tremendous fall. Uh, we saw a report last week that he's stepping away from the team to handle some personal issues, and wish him the best, obviously. But that does leave a hole in the lineup. Is Dalton Bargo the guy? Do you have a freshman like Levi Clark? Does this give him a chance to get in the lineup, or do you shuffle some things in the infield and maybe help your defense a little bit, and get a guy like um, Manny Marin or Ariel Antigua or one of those guys in the lineup, to give a different look. And I'm sure they'll try a lot of different things, as everyone does. But there are questions, and I do think that a lot of times when you win it all, and you're also picked in the top 5 the following year, there's not as many questions, and certainly, Tennessee's got a few, and but as evidenced by where they're picked to win it, we have a lot of confidence they're gonna answer those in the affirmative.
No doubt. Yeah. Perhaps the biggest just question in general comes on the mound where,
Mhm.
you're probably looking at Liam Doyle as a Friday guy, and man, it's dynamic stuff. It's Friday stuff. There's really no doubt about that. Yes, it's fastball velocity, but really more than that, it's the way the fastball moves. It's the fact that he has a varied arsenal. He kind of is a kitchen
Mhm.
sink pitcher where everything moves and he throws everything he's got at you. And so there's that, but it's a guy who had a nearly 6 ERA last year at Ole Miss. And
Yeah.
I think he was better than that. Like his peripheral numbers suggest he was probably better than that ERA would lead you to believe. However, we are talking about a guy that still has something to prove in that regard. So there's that. And then you've got, Nate Snead maybe in the rotation. And
Mhm.
again, excellent last year in the role he was in. How does he handle maybe something a little bit different? Can he be efficient enough to be a guy that gives you 5, 6, maybe 7? Brandon Arvidsson, a bounce back from Texas A&M via San Jacinto College. Tegan Kuhn's a freshman. Like talent is not the issue here, obviously, but this is a pitching staff that has kind of had the luxury of at least knowing something pretty much every year since this program really popped, right? I mean, last year, okay, it was kind of just Drew Beam, but at least you
Mhm.
had Drew Beam, right? Like if you're going to bank on somebody, at least it was this guy who's like his whole thing is that you know exactly what you're going to get from him. They
Mhm.
don't have that this year. They have some guys that have been good in one role, but they're moving to another, guys that are stepping up into bigger roles. So this to me is where there is the most uncertainty. Plenty of
Yeah.
talent, but a little bit of uncertainty in terms of what it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said it. I mean, can Liam Doyle be a Friday guy in the SEC? I think we all think the stuff's there, but it takes a lot more than that. Um, I think the other part of this is trying to, what are you going to get out of AJ Russell? Okay. So the thought is, he's injured at the moment. He is expected to return at some point during the spring. Um, what's his role? Can he can he move into the rotation? Is he an opener kind of guy, and then eventually, can he extend? Right? Is he himself? Those kinds of things. Because I mean, he's your ace if he's like he is when he's healthy. That would be big. A guy like Tanner Franklin had a big summer junior. I mean, transfer. It was Kennesaw, right? Kennesaw State, and really big arm, hard thrower. And of course, we saw Marcus Phillips talking about hard throwers. I mean, he's a 3-digit guy. So, to have those, this staff this season has more velocity and more stuff than last year's national championship team. Now they're not a better staff, but there's more there. Okay, so the question is, can they become productive, and can they learn the pitchability traits that last year's club did so well, and turned into one of the best pitching staffs in the country, despite not having as good a stuff as some of the others in the country, and certainly not as good as their successor here. So all of that makes another fascinating storyline as we wonder, you know we have a projected rotation today. We have their kind of tentative roles, but I kind of think by the time conference play rolls around, you're going to see some shifting around as people have either played their way in or out of those roles.
Such an interesting point you make about the comparison and stuff on the mound, because I think I tend to think of Tennessee just reloads every year with stuff, and
Mhm.
there there are a lot of teams that would love to have the stuff that last year's staff had. But to your point, okay, Snead, big time stuff, but outside of that, Drew Beam's stuff was just pretty good. Like he was more about moxie and command and location and things like that. Xander Sechrist, not a stuff guy.
Yeah, right.
Ozzy, good stuff in terms of movement, but not a light up the radar gun guy necessarily.
Yeah.
All
It's
the
very uncomfortable AB. Right.
Right, exactly. So there's some, because when we talk about stuff, people tend to think velocity. It's also kind of movement, which is, Aaron Combs
Mhm.
is kind of that example. But this is also a team that gave a lot of innings to Kirby Connell
Right.
and Chris Stamos, right? And of
Mhm.
course, Sechrist. And so this was not the staff you think of when I think you think Tennessee pitching staffs, and yet it was the one that won them a national title. So this as a difference, because I can't think of a more stark difference than last year, their Kirby Connell being maybe their most reliable relief guy, and this year they're looking at maybe Tanner Franklin or Marcus Phillips, right?
Mhm.
Like those guys are big time arm talents, but you're not exactly sure what you're going to get, and strikes might be at a little bit of a premium. So interesting point there. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that is a little fascinating subplot.
And you have to think Frank Anderson, the pitching coach, he's going to figure this out because he always does. And there'll be some pitchers that we aren't even talking about that haven't come up, and maybe they're not even thinking, and it's going to click. And they're going to get inserted in a midweek game, and next thing you know, they're going to be pitching on the weekend, and the next thing you know, they're going to be starting on the weekend, and it just sort of happens organically. Is that's his MO. So I do feel like this is a club that may get off to a so-so start and then absolutely catch fire as they they find their groove. So if you play them early. If you can work out your scheduling changes now, D1 said so. So you definitely don't want to be catching this team in April and May, or certainly in the postseason.
I did. Kendall was getting razzed on Twitter a little bit. Did you see this, Mark? About like in his tweet that sent a link out to one of our preview pieces for Tennessee. It might have been the top 25 breakdown or whatever. He said that Tennessee shows no signs of taking its foot off the brake. When I think he meant gas.
Yeah, we've all done it. Yeah,
Tennessee's just gonna stay in park, according to Kendall. So yeah,
maybe somebody's trying to push them down the hill. Maybe that's
maybe that's what it is. Yeah, they're trying to push them down the hill.
They're not going to go into the river.
Tennessee has their foot on the brake for dear life. Funny little typo there. Kendall just got his words mixed up there a little bit, but people on Twitter were giving him a hard time. Fascinating team, Mark. Obviously, so many things here. The how do you deal with being the dog caught the car, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like now what, right? You got to reload the thing, and then how do you deal with the expectations? How do you deal with kind of the come down off of that, right? Like if you're a returning player, like sheesh, doesn't get any better than that. How do you kind of try to get that same mojo going? And the answer is you don't. It has to be its own thing. But therein lies the challenge. So I know we will be fascinated along with really everyone around the country with this particular Tennessee team. All right, that is going to do for this edition of the Highway to Hoover podcast, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. As I mentioned at the top, our season preview edition of the podcast are rolling on here. Plenty more still to come, especially now that we have 16, not 14 teams in the SEC. So stay tuned. I don't ask for this kind of stuff much, but if you like the podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast, give it a 5 stars or a thumbs up or whatever it is that they ask for on various podcast apps.
Gold star. Yeah,
that's right. Yes. That stuff, really helps the visibility of the podcast, and we've seen the numbers grow. So we know that more and more people are listening to it. And if you haven't done that, take just a minute. I would also say, and I'm literally just winging this, Mark, if if you're so inclined, I know on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a little comment there. If you leave us a review and in it, ask a question that you have on your mind in this preseason, Mark and I will answer it on the show. How about that for a deal? So if you've got something that you really want to know about a certain team, we'll either fold it into that team's preview podcast, or, maybe we'll do a separate podcast if we have enough questions as the season nears. So go and leave a comment on Apple Podcasts. Yeah. And in your comment, leave a question. We'll be happy to answer it. If you give us 5 stars, we're not going to answer a question if you give us a 1-star, 1-star review. That's not really how that's going to work, but I think that goes without saying. So appreciate you all being on the ride here as we get ready for the 2025 season. Thank you to Mark, as always, for joining me. Thank you, the listeners, for listening. We'll talk to y'all soon.